We're doing a study on Ezra, but I have to have you turn to Psalm chapter 126, and I'll read that passage to you in just a moment. As I've gone through this study, I have really enjoyed this, and I've realized that the book of Ezra, I didn't predict this would happen, but it really ties in a lot of the Old Testament. That little short book ties in a lot of the Old Testament. As I mentioned, it's one of the last historical books we'll look at in the Old Testament. We go into prophetic books, inspirational books like Psalms, instructional books like Proverbs. So I like history, and I like how history ties itself together. And I didn't realize until I began this study how Ezra was a remarkable book in tying together many aspects of the Old Testament. And it all fits in just like a glove. So we're going to try to do that a little bit today. We started a series of points on the title of the spiritual renewal of God's people, what that is and how that plays out in our lives, and of course is applicable to us. We left off when I last taught on this dilemma that the people felt when they were in captivity in Babylon, and people were coming to them and they knew of their musical abilities. The Hebrews had always been involved in poetry and singing and worshiping the Lord, and they said, "Hey, sing us one of your songs. We want to hear one of your songs in your native tongue from your homeland." And they said, "How can we sing this song of praise to God in a strange land?" You know, they would be reminded about their captivity, about their longing for their homeland, and whatever else you can say about these people. Many of them were deeply patriotic. They loved their God. They loved their country. They loved their holy city of Jerusalem, and they had been long since removed from all of that. Their temple worship had been done away with as the temple was destroyed, and the places they remembered growing up were a distant memory at this point. And now, so many years had gone by, it was reaching the point where many people were born in captivity. All they'd known is captivity and bondage. When they heard people talk about the place that they grew up, and they didn't have a point of reference because they were born in Babylon. And so it was a very interesting period of life. However, there was always this hope that they would one day return. And then God works on the heart of his people in the book of Ezra, and works on the foreign king, and they were allowed to go back. And that initial group involved a number of about 50,000 people answered the call to go back to their homeland. And it must have been a very exciting stage for those who were brave enough and courageous enough to make that journey back. We discussed last week, involved a distance of about, when you navigate mountains and streams and rivers, a distance of about 1,000 miles. And so it wasn't going to be an easy journey, but they took it upon themselves to do it and started making their way back home. Matthew Henry wrote a commentary on the whole Bible. I happen to have that as one of my volumes in my library next door. And he wrote about Psalm 126. He said it was a psalm about the Jews who were part of this first wave of exiles going back to their homeland. And, we many of us are very familiar with there's only 6 verses in that psalm, as you can see. Many of us are very familiar with the last 2 verses. We've heard, I'm sure most every one of us have heard preaching on Psalm 126, the last verses 5 and 6, the last 2 verses, as it relates to the need to share our faith and go soul winning. And it's a great application, and there are certainly places for that passage to be used in that way. But Matthew Henry said that's not what this chapter was initially about. It was about the situation where God's people were going to go back home, and the feelings that they experienced as they made this long journey back home. In fact, Matthew Henry and other Bible scholars as well believe that Psalm 126 may have been authored by Ezra himself. I can't prove that to you, but I'm leaning that direction. The more I study this book and this Sunday school series, it would have been an amazing passage to look at, especially if Ezra wrote this. Now, you'll notice underneath Psalm 126, there's a little phrase there, most of you have in your Bibles. What 4 words do we read as a subtitle under Psalm 126? a song of degrees. Okay, so there are actually 15 of these, beginning in Psalm 120 and ending in Psalm 134. There's a special grouping of psalms. They're called a song of degrees. What in the world does that mean, a song of degrees? Maybe you read the book of Psalms many times. You came across that. Oh, yeah, song of degrees. Oh, there's another one, song of degrees. What is a song of degrees? It was believed that there were a certain group of psalms that were authored, not all of them by David. And in fact, if you look at Psalm 127, this is a song of degrees for Solomon. They were songs that they used in special worship settings that were sung in stages, degrees or stages. So I read several different commentaries on how this would play out in the lives of the average, Hebrew person going back to Jerusalem to celebrate these special religious festivals and holidays. And they would apparently sing them as they got closer to the city. They would go in an order in these 15 Psalms and sing them. The closer they got, the further they went in the book of Psalms. And some even believed that in the temple, the stairs in the temple, that they would stop on a stair of the temple and sing one of those psalms, go up another step and sing another one, and go up another step. And that's why the song of degrees as they went up. Anyway, they're filled with special meaning and purpose for God's people as they would worship Him and praise Him. And Psalm 126 specifically deals with the sentiments expressed by God's people as they made their way 50,000 strong on a 1,000-mile journey from captivity in Babylon back to the holy city of Jerusalem. Some of them having never seen it in their lives, just heard about it. And they would talk about, and the prophetic writers would talk about some of the sentiments on the part of the old-timers as they thought back to their holy city, and they would weep. They would weep with a sense of meaning and purpose, that they would go back to their homeland and see it once again. Can you imagine? Maybe some of you don't have those strong ties to your hometown, or if it's Fresno or somewhere else, but you have to tie in the fact that their worship of Jehovah was centered in the temple, and all of that took place in Jerusalem. And so the people would come from miles around, sometimes from neighboring countries, to travel back on these certain religious holidays to be among their people and worship in the temple again. It was truly significant for God's people to do that. We get up on Sunday and we drive to church, and if you're like me, we sometimes take that for granted. I get to go to church today and see my friends at church and hear from God's word. It carried tremendous relevance for God's people. So with that backdrop, look at Psalm 126. It says, "When the Lord turned again the captivity of Zion, we were like them that dream. Then was our mouth filled with laughter, and our tongue with singing. Then said they among the heathen, the Lord hath done great things for them. The Lord hath done great things for us, whereof we are glad. Turn again our captivity, O Lord, as the streams in the south." Then it says these familiar verses, "They that sow in tears shall reap in joy, and he that goeth forth and weepeth, bearing precious seed, shall doubtless come again with rejoicing, bringing his sheaves with him." Imagine now that chapter, that very familiar psalm, in light of their return to Jerusalem after 70 years of captivity. Do you not sense their unreserved joy? To these pilgrims, it seemed like, it was like, pinch me. Am I dreaming? Are we really going back to our holy city, going back to our homeland? They could sing and laugh once more, as if for the last 70 years they've been in a stage of mourning or in happiness. And even the heathen nations, and certainly as represented by Cyrus, it could be said that God could even tell that he is with his people once more. Now we're talking about spiritual renewal. The bad thing about finding needs for revival, it's appropriate perhaps, Pastor Rocky, that we have a special speaker. Revival meetings coming up in less than a month in our church. We need these times for our church and in individual lives to reflect upon where we stand before the Lord. The bad thing about it is most often we don't know we're in need of it. Remember now, a small percentage of the people who were given a free invitation to go back to their homeland, only a small percentage took them up on that. Others regretted that they did not come with the first wave of exiles, and they made additional pilgrimages back with different people, but some never left Babylon. Some never saw a need to leave this place of captivity. And among them, ironically, were David, who didn't stay because he didn't care about his homeland. And we'll look at a passage in a moment, quite the opposite, but he felt like he needed to minister to those who remained behind. But we often don't sense that we are in need of revival, renewal in our hearts and in our minds. And the Bible is describing it here and other places, like I read to you last week with David, where we get to these dry places, these parched places. I was the timekeeper for that 5K yesterday, and people were coming through, particularly the children. And as soon as they crossed that finish line, I sent them all, okay, go up there. And if you ran that race, you remember me saying so. All right, go up, get a drink of water, or in my case, sweet tea, whatever does it for you. Get up there and get something cold to drink. They were dry. They're running out in a dry, dusty place for a race. And when you get done like that, you just want something to cool your throat and to revive you. That's the need that we have in our spiritual lives. A need to be refreshed and revived, spiritually speaking. When God himself can say the Lord hath done great things for us, where we are glad. And so, we all know that God sent them out in this terrible place of bondage for a reason. He needed to get them to a place where they needed him. So God sometimes sends us to a dry place, a difficult place, to get to a point where we realize, I need the Lord in my life. And so that's what spiritual renewal is all about. It accomplishes God's grand purpose. But notice, secondly, that was the first point. Aiden, do you have that up there? For the first point, do we have that? Are you still looking for it? We're going to wait for you. That's the title. Should be the next slide. I gave you all that time to find that first point up there, so our people could write it down. Well, it is spiritual renewal, accomplishes now that you found it, it's time to move beyond that to the next point. It accomplishes God's grand purpose. Secondly, it acquires God's great power. So, now that we're back in Ezra, when you read those first 3 verses, if you were like me, I get confused. I'm going through a devotional process where I journal. And sometimes I get really confused in this section of history because I'm writing things down and I'm thinking, I thought I wrote about this before. Well, there's a strong similarity between the Kings and the Chronicles. Some of the stories we find in the 1st and 2nd Kings are repeated, sometimes verbatim, in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And when you got to those first 3 verses of Ezra chapter 1, I'm sure some of you said, I read that somewhere recently. Didn't we just read that? And you would have, as we finish 2nd Chronicles. If you look at 2nd Chronicles 36, in verse number 22, it says, Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord, spoken by the mouth of Jeremiah, might be accomplished, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and put it also in writing, saying, Thus saith Cyrus, king of Persia, all the kingdoms of the earth hath the Lord God of heaven given me, and he hath charged me to build him an house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is there among you of all his people, that the Lord his God be with him, and let him go up? So that's how 2nd Chronicles ends. Ezra has almost the same wording in the first 3 verses. Same thing happening there in the very next book of the Bible. So this message from Jeremiah came to God's people while they were still in captivity. And the point being, God had not forgotten about his people. He was not so angry with them, he said, let them suffer in captivity and bondage. He was giving them a message of encouragement and hope while they were still in Babylon, while they were still exiled, while they were still living in subjection to the Babylonians. And God was still speaking to his people. I'm going to have you look at different passages today. You can keep your finger there in Ezra 1 if you want to, but if you turn to Jeremiah chapter 29, All of these passages put things in perspective. Jeremiah chapter 29 deals with the same period of history. And verse number 10 gives specific dates. For thus saith the Lord, that after 70 years be accomplished at Babylon, I will visit you and perform my good word toward you in causing you to return to this place. For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, God says, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you an expected end. Then shall ye call upon me, and I shall go and pray unto me, and I will hearken unto you. And ye shall seek me and find me, when ye shall search me with all your heart. That's important in regard to personal spiritual renewal. And I will be found of you, saith the Lord, and I will turn away your captivity, and I will gather you from all the nations and from all the places whither I have driven you, saith the Lord, and I will bring you again into the place whence I caused you to be carried away captive. So that was a message of Jeremiah to God's people living in captivity in Babylon. And all Ezra is a fulfillment of what God had said to his people earlier. He said it through Jeremiah and Isaiah and other prophets as well. The book of Ezra is just about a fulfillment of God's promises. He says, in a sense, that he had wounded his people, but now would be a time of healing. It involved a terrible time of death. Remember when the Babylonians came and they besieged the city, asked them to surrender, and there were different kings ruling the nation of Judah at the time, and some were more defiant than others, and some of them said, sure, we'll surrender. And then later on, when the Babylonians got distracted by a war with another nation, the Egyptians, the king of Judah said, well, I changed my mind. We're going to go with our original plan here and just leave us alone. And so the Babylonians came back more than once. And when they besieged the city the final time and they would not surrender, the Babylonians were very angry. Their king and their soldiers were very angry. And so they broke into Jerusalem. They reduced the temple to rubble. They burned all of their houses. They carried away anything of value. And the Bible also says that they killed their young men. Their soldiers were slain. And anybody that had any abilities or talents or could be instrumental in helping them back in Babylon, they carried away captive. It was a different philosophy as compared to the Medes and Persians. They brought their people back to assimilate them into their culture, and they pretty much left just a small remnant of people who were of no use to them. Older people, Pastor Joel, like me. I don't know, what can he do? Leave the older people there, let them. And the people that were there were defeated, dejected, their houses has been burned, the infirmed, the weak, the leprous, the aged people were left back. They could not take care of themselves. They barely could eke out a living and survive during these difficult times. And it was a terrible time. They had known death, and now God said, I'm going to bring you life. They had only known, some of them, bondage, and now they would enjoy freedom. And it was a time of terrible sadness, and now God would bring them, in the book of Psalms, it says, laughter and joy. I mean, they were so happy about going back that they were laughing. Now, let me go over these dates because they're somewhat confusing if we don't take it in perspective. By the way, there's some more of those charts, and some of you should get some of those get a chart if you don't have one. Who can I get in the back? Brother Slavic, can you see on the back table, are there some more of these charts? Can you see if they're in the foyer? And if you did not get one of these charts, you probably need to grab one to put all of this in perspective. I don't know if there's any. Are there any back there? Oh, just kidding, Brother Slavic. I realized somebody put them all up here. I'm sorry. Do you have a volunteer? Thank you, Emiliano. You haven't done anything all weekend anyway. Emiliano played in the first half of a soccer game, rushed over, and ran a 5K after that. So you, of all people, should be in shape. If you didn't get one of those charts, could you raise your hand? Emiliano will get one of those to you. It'll put things in perspective. But let me share with you the timing, because prophets specifically said there would be a 70-year period of captivity. Well, we know that Jerusalem fell and the temple was destroyed in 586 BC. But you have to remember this. It didn't all happen at one time. It came in waves. First they came, and the king capitulated and said, they resisted, and he finally came out and said, hey, sorry, we didn't know you were at the door. We didn't know you were here, really. We didn't know your armies. And he said, oh, yeah? And he carried away captive to Babylon. And then they left. And then the new king came into place, and he rebelled against Babylon. So they sent another group. This took place over decades, 2 or 3 decades. The people in Jerusalem were resisting Babylonian rule. And so when they finally came in the last time, it was 586 BC. You can look at your chart for some of these dates. And that's when they really razed the city, burnt down the temple, carried everything away, and killed their young men. Well, Cyrus issued his decree for them to go and return to Jerusalem in 538 BC. We know that from historical records. Well, if you do the math, that's not 70 years. It's not 70 years because, they came in. The first group of exiles was carried away in a certain year, and the first group of pilgrims came back in a certain year, but they came in stages. The key factor on your chart, you can see there was a 22-year period. I should allude to it on my chart. Here it is. If you have one of these charts now, on this section right here, about 22 years. There's a 22-year period between the time that the first exiles returned, which must have taken some time, on foot to go 1,000 miles around mountain ranges and through water bodies. It took a long time to get there, but then they took a lot longer time to rebuild the temple. So it was a process that took place over a period of time, and also they came back in waves. They didn't come all back at the same time. But the city of Jerusalem was finally rebuilt, and the temple worship restored, and it took a period of about 70 years of the captivity. And the Lord worked on the heart of an otherwise hardened man, a warrior. Cyrus in his own right was a warrior, moved up through the military ranks and became king. And he did this to a man that was not even one of his own children or even in sympathy to the worship of Jehovah. He was a pagan king, and he had pagan gods. And all that changed as God moved upon his heart. Now, I'm going to share something with you that I discovered 2 weeks ago or so when I put this lesson together, that to me is worth your trip to church today. Some of you said, I could have slept in another hour and come into the morning service, heard Pastor Joel preach a wonderful message, but I decided to get up an hour early and come in early for Sunday school today. I'm going to make it worth your while right here. I'm going to show you something that I found absolutely fascinating, and it's found in the book of Isaiah, of all places. So I want you to turn to Isaiah chapter 44. Remember, we mentioned some of the prophets that were alive and involved in the life of God's people during the time of the Babylonian captivity and the defeat of Jerusalem and the fall of the temple and all of these events that took place. I'm going to read you something, and then I'm going to give you just a minute of explanation. And if you're like me, you're going to be like, wow, that is amazing. This is an amazing fact of the Bible right here. Isaiah 44, verse 28. That saith of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and shall perform all my pleasure. God is talking about what he would do in this pagan king's heart. Even saying to Jerusalem, thou shalt be built, and to the temple, thy foundation shall be laid. Look in chapter 45. We're going to continue there. It says there, thus saith the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden, to subdue nations before him, speaking of the Babylonians there, and I will loose the loins of kings to open before him the 2-leaved gates, and the gates shall not be shut. And I will go before him and make the crooked places straight. I will break in pieces the gates of brass and cut in sunder the bars of iron. And I will give thee the treasures of darkness and hidden riches of secret places, that thou mayest know that I, the Lord, which call thee by the name, am the God of Israel. For Jacob my servant's sake and my Israel mine elect, I have called thee by thy name. Speaking to Cyrus, I have surnamed thee, though thou hast not known me. I am the Lord, and there is none else. There's no God beside me. I girded thee, though thou hast not known me. Now, that's a great passage, right? It's showing how God worked in the heart of Cyrus and moved upon him, and revealed himself to him, and God knew him by name. And Isaiah is prophesying this event that took place that would lead to the exiles being returned to Jerusalem. But here's the amazing thing. This is why you came to Sunday school today. Those words were given to Isaiah 150 years before Cyrus ever came into power. Cyrus was not even born when Isaiah the prophet uttered those words, prophesying what would happen in God returning his people from exile to their home city of Jerusalem. Even to the point, with so much detail, that God called Cyrus out by name through a prophecy that Isaiah gave 150 years earlier. He called him by name. He was not even born yet. Did you see the details? Remember a couple weeks ago I told you, just as off of memory, I should have pulled out, if I was prepared, I would have put out a good historical document and giving all the details of how the battle strategies employed by Cyrus's troops and how they decided to go and divert the waters of the Euphrates River, which, as I mentioned, ran through the city of Babylon underneath, and that city ran right through their city. So the river ran right through the city. So they have a water supply through that. Nebuchadnezzar was able to put up his famous hanging gardens and please his wife because she missed her homeland, and all these elaborate things, and they had plenty of food and water because of the river. Well, that river the city was built over that river for sustainable reasons, also became their problem when Cyrus, and who told Cyrus's military advisors, or Cyrus himself, who brought it to their mind that they should dam up that water, divert the waters of the Euphrates River? Did you see the detail in Isaiah about how the iron gates would be opened? The waters ran through, but they understood for reasons of security that they couldn't just, it's possible if you could hold your breath long enough to jump in one side of the wall, swim through that passage and get to the other and pop up and another soldier, and they could muster a little force of soldiers there. So they built iron gates. This city was impregnable. I preached in the book of Daniel several years ago and told you there wasn't just one wall. It's not like this castle wall, on the outside. It was thick, 20, 30 yards worth of walls, and there was a wall, a moat, and another wall. You could not bust through that wall. On the top, they had weaponry that would allow them to pour hot oil on invading troops, and there were all types of other machinery past their time in history that they could use to fire at the enemy if they got near that wall. I mean, it's hard. You could not go through the walls of Babylon. No military power would have any chance. Our modern military, well, I don't know, if you take some of the high-powered stuff, I guess you could blow anything up. But if you take an infantry troop and say, go ahead, attack that ancient city of Babylon, get through there and defeat their king, they would have no chance whatsoever to do that without modern weaponry. But they had that river going through the city. And God put it in the minds of Cyrus's military advisors to divert those waters, break through the rusted iron gates that the Euphrates River came through. It had to allow water but not people. They broke through those gates, and that's how they destroyed Babylon and overcame the city of Babylon. And God said what would happen 150 years before the event. Now, my question was, I could not find it anywhere. Did somebody representing the Mede and the Persian armies have access to Isaiah's writings, and said, oh, that's an idea. That's an idea. Why don't we just divert the water? I don't know, but I do know this. Nobody knew, I don't think for a moment, Cyrus's parents named him because they looked at some ancient Hebrew prophetic document and said, oh, it says that some dude named Cyrus is going to attack Babylon and overthrow them. Why don't we all start naming our boys Cyrus, so maybe he'll be the one to do it. I don't think for a moment that happened. You cannot explain Isaiah 44 and 45 and the events of Ezra chapter 1 in any other terms except God did something great for his people. And he even told them what he was going to do 150 years before it happened. That's worth your trip to church right there in Sunday school. You didn't say, you got to look at this passage in Isaiah chapter 45 and see how God predicted this would happen way before the fact. By the way, you can get that information and other information out of a very insightful book written by a guy named Josh McDowell, and it's entitled Evidence That Demands a Verdict. Any of you have that book? Patrick, you're the only one. I'm not surprised you would have it. You know a lot about the Bible. Everybody ought to have one of those. You got to have Fox's Book of Martyrs. You got to have In His Steps by Charles Sheldon, and you got to have Evidence That Demands a Verdict by a guy named. He wrote a sequel to that called More Evidence That Demands a Verdict. If you want to look into a subject called apologetics, defending your faith, defending the Bible's credibility and reliability, those two books, 2-volume books, will blow any secular, humanistic, unbelieving professor in any educational setting out of the water. And then you can say, as the Bible says, I am smarter than all my teachers. That's right from the Bible. I forgot, I just showed, William, where was it? I shared that with you guys in the Bible. Remember that? I forgot where that's found. Somebody said, I'm smarter than all my teachers. And if you get those books, you'll be smarter than all of your teachers. We had a college professor, of all things, an anthropology professor who was in our church. Wonderful man and his family. Had a little girl, he and his wife, and we had him. He came for years, probably 2 years to our church, and I would preach on Sunday morning, and I would say, if you've never trusted Christ as your Savior, raise your hand. He'd raise his hand every time. He kept saying, I'm not saved, I'm not saved. And he kept coming to church. I'm not saved, I'm not saved, I'm not saved. Sometimes I'd pull him in, now what is Pastor Joel's office. And I'd pull him there after church, and we'd go talk somewhere and share, and he says, I just can't get by some of this, I can't. And it took him 2 years. Was that, Jan, about 2 years before he finally got saved? It's just sometimes all this academic information in our heads make it difficult for us to understand the truth. But the one wonderful way you can take people like that, they're intellectual people, is to show them how prophecy is fulfilled. And this one was 150 years prior to the fact. So God had his fingerprints all over this entire ordeal. Which brings me to the third point. And since I don't have time, I'll be sharing that. Aiden and Russell, that third point, we're going to start next Sunday school lesson out under the third point, which is spiritual renewal aligns with God's gracious promises. We're going to get some leading figures in this whole narrative and see how God ties in great people like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Daniel and Ezra and Zerubbabel and Nehemiah. And he ties all of these people together, each with their own perspectives and gifts and abilities. He ties them all together to fulfill his purposes for his people by using these people in significant ways. We're going to look at some of those. And including that list of people that God used is Cyrus himself, who he mentioned him by name 150 years before he came to power. And he placed it upon his heart, a pagan king, an unsaved king. He placed it upon his heart to make a decree to send his people back to their homeland. And I can promise you this, he's working behind the scenes in our lives as well. And we need to embrace that truth and look for those opportunities for him to lead us when he gives us those opportunities.